Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we'll explore one of the Second World War's most dramatic and daring special operations, the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, the Nazi ruler in occupied Czechoslovakia. Hi, Jesse. Another week, another podcast. Here we are again. And this time we're doing it slightly differently from our normal routine, aren't we? So what are we doing different today?
Well, hello, everybody out there. Today's a little bit different, as you say. It's a bit of a special occasion. We have our first guest on the podcast. Repeat listeners and viewers will know that normally we do this as a two-man show. Welcome to any new listeners or viewers out there. And we've got a third face here. It's Dan Hill from our sister podcast about the First World War, Not So Quiet on the Western Front. And Dan has kindly joined us today because he knows a bit more than we do about the Heydrich assassination and decided to be a good colleague and come and talk with us about it for all of your benefit out there. So welcome, Dan. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, gents. It's a pleasure to be joining you in the relatively rarefied air, for me at least, of the Second World War. So I definitely am going to try and stick to my lane and talk about exactly what I know, which I'm glad you emphasized a bit more than you on this subject, because it's not going to be a huge amount. But it is a subject that I've been covering fairly recently in a bit of detail. So I, like you guys, find it a fascinating topic. And we're looking forward to kind of exploring the nuts and bolts of Operation Anthropoid in a bit more detail.
That's absolutely brilliant. As Jesse said, well, you are the expert, so maybe we jump right in and start with the topic here. And what we always do, dear listeners, you will probably remember this if you are a listener to our podcast and have listened to us before, we start normally quite big and look at the strategic context before we then zoom in and look at the nitty-gritty, tactical or whatever it is stuff that we are exploring. So maybe it might be quite a good idea to set the scene a little bit and talk about Heydrich, a very, very famous, infamous character of the Second World War. So, Dan, what can you tell us about Heydrich? A little bit about his background.
Well, I mean, he's an interesting character, and I described recently when talking about him, if you were to kind of draw the quintessential Third Reich Nazi era villain that you would then cast in a film, some dodgy film in the 1950s or 60s, he wouldn't look that dissimilar from someone like Reinhard Heydrich. This is physically a tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, 38-year-old, real rising star within the Nazi party. He's a young man that's, and that is relatively young for the very senior rank that he achieves. That is, physically an imposing character. He's a big sportsman. He comes from a fencing fraternity at university. He's got this kind of background that he, that suggests that a number of things about him, he's going to go places. And, he's also, he's physically courageous. He's a courageous person. He shows this in action a number of times. He's also utterly, utterly ruthless, which I think is the thing that predominates through his personality. And we'll see this in a number of places. And despite having what on face value might look like all of the attributes that are required for kind of late 1930s Germany to go somewhere, he actually has a bit of a shaky start. And I think, Matthias, you and I have spoken about this before, because he makes some pretty big errors early on in his career.
Well, he does. So, he wants to join the Navy. He actually does join the Navy. And as you said, he's the rising star. And even in the Navy, he's doing really well, you might say. But then, of course, he throws this all away, because what happens is that he has promised marriage to a particular girl. He then, at a party of a rowing club, meets another girl, promises to marry her, and he doesn't have the guts to tell this other girl. It's only when he then gets engaged that he basically just sends this engagement announcement in the newspaper to the first girl. And of course, that's a no-go. You can't really do this. He is then summoned to a court of honor by the Navy. And in reality, if he'd done this, he promised marriage to someone else, then married another girl. You could get away with it probably if you do it in the right way. But because he does it in such a fundamentally wrong way, they say, you know what, this is a no-go. We can't have this. So this is against the honor of the officer corps. And they basically sack him. And so when he's a first lieutenant, he is sacked and he is penniless. And he is having problems. His family are having problems because his father is an opera singer. He founds a music school in the city of Halle, where the Heydrich family are from. And because you're now in the early 1930s, you've got the economic depression. And of course, the first thing where people start to save money is by cultural things. So they don't have enough money coming into the school. So the entire family is struggling. And he is struggling even more. So that's a huge problem.
I think one of the other key things to point out about Heydrich, and it's perhaps no surprise given what you've just described, that he still wants to climb a career path and he wants to find somewhere to go. And actually, given that he has some attributes, including that utterly ruthless streak, the SS seems like a fairly reasonable home. They're a little more lax in terms of these these old-fashioned naval honor-based elements, and that gets let slide, and he ends up actually becoming Himmler's personal adjutant, and that's gonna, like many things do, really rocket him up the chain. And actually, by the time we get to the outbreak of the Second World War, and more specifically hit 1941, which is really the time period that we're going to be looking at, he's an SS Obergruppenführer, so very senior, and he's also going to be appointed the director of Bohemia and Moravia, modern-day Czech Republic, separate from Slovakia at that time, we should add. And that's going to be, so by September 1941, he's already in a really senior position. But at the same time, and Jesse, I don't know to what extent you guys have covered this on the podcast before, he's also responsible for, he heads up the Reich's main security office, which is responsible for two of the most grim things in the entire Second World War. One of them is under Heydrich's personal supervision, is going to be Einsatzgruppe, and the second is going to be the Wannsee Conference.
Yeah, I mean, he's kind of as senior as it gets. And I don't know, I think it's interesting when we think about an individual character like Heydrich, and then a cultural and collective and political unit like Bohemia, like Czechoslovakia. This is kind of an interesting sort of intersection of two different ways of looking at history, or two different, levels of history in a way. I don't want to get too thinky about it, but that's something that I always think about. You have this one individual with this interesting and, let's say, unfortunate story in the end, more than unfortunate, of course. And you have the people of Bohemia, the Czechs, right, who already have a difficult situation in the war because the Munich Agreement in 1938 leads to the establishment of this protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, which is essentially mostly today's Czechia, minus the edges that were directly annexed by Nazi Germany. And these are the people over whom Heydrich is going to rule. And so his experience and his philosophy, I guess you could say, and his cruelty that rocket him up the SS chain of command with the Reich Security Main Office, they also play out in how he, quote unquote, governs these Czech lands. So Dan, I don't know how much you've been in, how much work you've done on that Czech side. What's the impact of his policies? I mean, he gets some nicknames that give us a little bit of a hint as to how he rules the place.
Yeah, I think probably the Butcher of Prague, or the Beast alternatively used, gives you some kind of idea that, this ruthlessness does not go away with promotion to Reichsprotector. I mean, there are some things that are instituted that I think you could argue, generally speaking, that regardless of who the person was, you would see that same thing happen. Rationing comes in, forced labor eventually comes in as well. This is a real big thing, and it's a tricky one because, we're trying to officially, this line that's being straddled, particularly with the Sudetenland, this has been incorporated into Greater Germany at this point. What kind of rules are going to be imposed in this area, as opposed to the rest of what we'd call now the Czech Republic or Czechia, which is in a slightly odd position. So, I mean, when Heydrich does come in, though, it's crystal clear. We are going to be putting very solid lines down on the ground, which you simply do not cross. We're going to be instituting much stricter rationing. There's going to be very strong movements towards effectively forced labor, and just a general repressive atmosphere that gets clamped down on the Czech Republic. Now, bear in mind, at the same time happening across the English Channel in London, the Czech government in exile has been set up under a guy by the name of Edvard Beneš. And these guys, understandably, are trying to still exert some kind of influence, much like the Free French are, and under de Gaulle. It's the same kind of thing. What can we do from London that's going to show our people in occupied Czech Republic, that we're still here, we're still listening, we're still willing to put ourselves on the line. And that's going to really bring about what eventually will become Operation Anthropoid, because Beneš and his head of intelligence, a man by the name of Colonel Moravec, are going to start looking for some way of venting this anger and frustration of the Czech government and the Czech people towards a central figure. And it makes sense quite quickly that central figure is going to come in the form of this one man who not only does some pretty horrific stuff outside of Czech Republic, but also is directly responsible for the repression within it. And so that kind of clash of ideas and opportunities is going to form around this operation.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out, if we have any listeners in particular in Slovakia, that because the two were divided this time, we tend to shorthand talk about the Czechs, talk about the equivalent of the Czech Republic, because the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia partly corresponds to today's Czechia. But of course, the government in exile is the Czechoslovak government, and there are Slovaks involved in the whole situation to some extent. There are fewer than Czechs. But I just wanted to, because they're my neighbors here in Austria, I wanted to make sure we use Czech as a shorthand, but of course it still is going to be reestablished as Czechoslovakia and was beforehand. Maybe just one little grain of other context. I think it's under Heydrich that the infamous concentration camp of Theresienstadt is established as well. So that goes towards the butcher reputation. I once interviewed, mini tangent here. We do this all the time on the podcast, Dan. We go often into rabbit holes. Mini tangent. At a goulash cookout at a friend of mine's, I once spoke with his grandfather, who had been a young German conscript in the Second World War, and who lived in Czechoslovakia as part of the German-speaking minority there. And one of his memories was that his fellow Czech-speaking citizens had it much easier than the German speakers, because they only had to do normal work. Germans were subject to conscription. And to me, this was quite an interesting moment. It's not the only moment I've experienced like this, but it was quite an interesting moment to see how decades later, all the information is at hand, and yet often personal memories go completely against the historical reality. So I don't know, that was just a little moment that I thought about in connection to Bohemia and Moravia, because that has always stuck with me. I meant to do something with that interview, and I thought, I'm just going to take it away as a personal lesson about memories versus history. In any case, let's close off that little tangent. Tell us more about the planning phases. How is Heydrich selected? Who's going to be doing this? What do the British do when they're coordinating this with the Czechs? Because I thought that was an interesting element of the story.
Yeah, the whole concept comes about really from this desire, and it is Czech-led originally. This desire to strike back, to do something, make some powerful sign that the Czech government is still exerting influence on their albeit occupied homeland. And one organisation they turn to, fairly newly created with a broad but relatively explicit remit to set Europe ablaze, is the SOE, the Special Operations Executive. I don't know how much you've covered them in previous episodes here. I think today the SOE, if you were to talk about SOE, it's somebody with a well-rod pistol tucked under a coat, cycling through a French countryside up against a German checkpoint somewhere. The truth is, SOE is pretty amateur at the outbreak of the war. There's some terrible mistakes made. What there is, though, is absolutely boatloads of courage. And in terms of finding people who are willing to be sent back into occupied Europe, into various different countries to try and take part in what would normally be liaising and organizing with resistance groups, occasionally undertaking sabotage missions, and even more rarely trying to assassinate individuals. These are some of the things that you might find SOE agents doing. And quite often they're not going to be British agents, but rather they're going to be natives of the particular country that they get sent back into. And that applies here. We should mention, much like the Free French, there's no shortage of people who manage to escape Czech Republic, Bohemia Moravia, before the either before the Germans arrive or shortly afterwards and make their way to, in this case, the United Kingdom. And there are plenty of people willing to risk their lives at the opportunity, at least, of ending somebody like Reinhard Heydrich. So there's no shortage of individuals, two of whom we'll come on to talk about. Jan Kubiš and Josef Gabčík are going to be the men ultimately responsible. But they're effectively called on by Colonel Moravec, who is the head of Czech intelligence, and the decision is made. Which kind of characters should we try and assassinate here? There's talk of a man by the name of Frank. There's talk of various other characters kind of high up in the echelons of the Nazi Party who exert specific influence on Bohemia and Moravia, and it's decided and fairly clear cut. Actually, I would find it hard to find anybody more suitable for assassination than Reinhard Heydrich. He kind of fits the bill quite well. I think the thing about him, Matthias, in terms of this particular character, is, of course, he's wearing multiple hats, and I'd love to know what you think. But there's quite often conversation said that this man is literally tipped to be the successor of Adolf Hitler in the Nazi Party and to take over the reins of the whole operation. I don't know, what do you make of it?
I think at that particular stage, that's probably a little bit far-fetched because there are other people waiting in line. But he was, as you said at the very beginning, he was definitely the rising star within the party, in particular within the SS. He had a very, very close relationship with Himmler. Göring, for example, during the Nuremberg trials, he talks about this and he says Himmler was absolutely stupid and the brains of the SS was Heydrich. So he's clever. He's not a stupid man. He knows how to do things. He's, as we said, he's ruthless. He's committed. He is driven. I mean, when you look at what happens even before the outbreak of the war, the things that he does, for example, he is responsible for the execution of Himmler's predecessor as head of the SS. He's involved in the long nights, all these things. So here he is an utterly ruthless character. So should he have lived for another 10, 15, 20 years, and should the Nazi state and the Wehrmacht being victorious, I wouldn't rule that out at all. A bit early at that particular stage, but definitely up on the rise. And again, this ruthlessness also comes through when you look at the very early stage. How does he actually get into these positions? How does he establish contact, for example, with Himmler? So it's done through his wife. His wife is a very, very convinced Nazi. To begin with, when Hitler marries her, Heydrich marries her. So the stories go, he isn't actually that much of a Nazi. He's just looking for a job. He then gets sacked. He needs a job somewhere. Then she says, well, why don't you work for the party? And he does that. And when he then becomes the head of the intelligence service of the SS, that's also very interesting because Himmler invites him for a meeting, cancels the meeting. Heydrich's wife tells him, no, you're going anyway. So you can see the importance of women behind a great man. Great, but debatable, but you know what I mean.
In quotation marks.
Exactly. She sends him there, has the meeting with Himmler, and Himmler is so impressed. And all that Heydrich has done at that particular stage, he'd read a number of reports from the head of the German military intelligence in the First World War, and that's the only input that he has. And there's a story that Himmler misunderstood what he actually done because Heinrich had been trained as a Nachrichtenoffizier, which in German can mean two things really. It can mean intelligence officer or signals officer. He's a signals officer. He's never done any intelligence in his life. And Heydrich gets that wrong. But just by sheer tenacity and willpower and persuasion, he manages to convince Himmler that he is the right man for that job. And when you look at what Hitler said of him, absolutely, again, the great person. He also says afterwards in his eulogy that he was actually a bit stupid. Why? He was too brave. He shouldn't have been driving around. We get to that in more detail in his open car all by himself. So, yes, absolutely, a rising star. A bit too early to say he's not the number 2 at that particular stage. 10 years down the line, very much so, I would have said.
I mean, it's interesting to kind of hear that said, and clearly, he's identified by the Czechs, by Beneš and Beneš's exiled government as somebody that needs to be taken out. Can be the source of this venting of frustration. It's also discussed in quite a lot of detail, actually, what the repercussions might be of doing something like this. And as maybe we get through and carry on into this, the repercussions are utterly horrific. And, it's really what mires this whole story and controversy even to this present day. But the decision is made. Heydrich is going to be the subject of assassination, and Czech agents are going to be trained. In fact, they're in training throughout this entire period to eventually be parachuted into the Czech Republic, parachuted not far from Pilsen, actually, link up with the existing Czech resistance network, which is around there. And typically they're leaned around, they're kind of clustered around the Catholic Eastern Orthodox Church in the city. But there are various different characters that are going to come to the fore. So these agents are going to be inserted into the city, and they're not given any specific remit at first, which is quite interesting. They're basically told, go there, link up with the resistance, find a spot to kill him, find a way to kill him, find a date to kill him, and then kill him. And then if you can, get out of there. That's pretty broad. There's no specifics about this. But the die have been cast to a certain extent. And by 18th of December, 1941, Czech agents are going to leave a place called Porchester House in London, right in the heart of London. It's the famous Czech intelligence headquarters. And there's a particular brick wall that all agents who are going to get sent into occupied Czech Republic a photograph against this same spot on this same brick wall. And it's really interesting because we get a gallery of agents just before leaving. In fact, everybody involved in this operation, including the bad guys, are all photographed against this wall. So you get Joseph Gabčík, you get Jan Kubiš, you get Adolf Palka, all of these kind of characters. And one other man who is going to become infamous in this story, a man by the name of Karol Čurda, who's also a Czech agent, is going to be photographed right there. But only a few days later, with Moravec at their sides, Kubiš and Gabčík, along with 4 other Czech agents who've got their own little resistance missions within the city of Prague itself, are going to find themselves on a modified Halifax bomber heading out as part of the special duty squadrons and parachuting into the snow of the Czech Republic. And that's really where this mission is going to start. Jesse, from this point of view, I don't know whether you guys have covered the story in any detail, but that kind of moment of landing and trying to link up with resistance is utterly fraught with dangers, particularly if you missed your target, as they do in this case. But have you guys covered in detail before, or had a brief look at exactly how people would make that link up?
Well, we haven't covered it in particular detail, not for this story, but in general, I mean, even going back to the First World War, where you have amphibious landings, say, at Gallipoli, where the Australians end up at the wrong place. I mean, this is the old idea that as soon as the first shot is fired, all your plans kind of go out the window. You need plans, but you also need to expect that they're going to be useless pretty quickly. And I think that's a hallmark of special operations. And it's one of the reasons why maybe not having such a detailed set of instructions is not always a bad thing, because it allows these agents to make decisions on their own, to adapt to problems. And they do have some issues, as you mentioned, right? That they're dropped not quite where they were supposed to be dropped. They nonetheless still manage to get in touch with certain families, stay at safe houses until they make their way from Pilsen is the German word that's in my head. It has a Czech name as well, which I think is more difficult for me to pronounce. And then they end up making it to Prague in the end. I had a question though, Dan, and we didn't prepare these questions in advance. But when we talk so much about Heydrich, I mean, of course, he's a higher ranking figure in the power structures of the day, so there's more known about him. People like us pay more attention to him on podcast episodes like this one. But can we say a bit more about Gabčík and Kubiš? What do we know about them as people, as soldiers, as resistance fighters? Because, they're trying to do something. And as we'll get into, as you alluded to, it is controversial, this whole operation. But they are courageous. They are brave. They are taking their lives into their hands. Actually, I would say to a much greater extent than Heydrich ever did, because they are going into the enemy's territory as small fry, so to speak. So Do we know more about them that we can share?
Yeah, what's really interesting about Kubiš and Gabčík is actually, I mean, first of all, they're best friends. These are guys that have served together really since 1939, and they've got a very similar story as a result of that. They're absolutely well known. In fact, ironically, one of the people who comments most powerfully on their connection and their closeness is none other than Karol Czurda, who and the irony will become clear if you don't know the story already by now. But these two men leave Czechoslovakia in, I think, I could be corrected on this, I think it's late 1938 or even early 1939, and eventually make their way over to France. And they're going to arrive into France and join what is effectively the Czech division of the French Foreign Legion. So it's a free Czech unit that is raised, and they're going to take part in their fighting in 1940, where both men are going to earn the Czechoslovak War Cross. And I think Gabčík is also going to earn the Croix de Guerre for his abilities in the field. They're both senior non-commissioned officers. In fact, by the time they redeploy into the Czech Republic, they're both holding the rank of effectively company sergeant major. So they're senior NCOs. They're experienced young men, both in their late 20s, but also absolutely willing to risk everything, roll the dice in order to have a crack at Reinhard Heydrich. And I think in a way they're kind of they're emblematic of many Czechs who find themselves in very similar situations during the early years of the Second World War. There are a lot of men who do the same thing, who decide that they want to leave the country, they want to go and re-link up with their government in exile, and they want to take the fight to the enemy. And of course, there's no doubt that this is very likely a one-way journey. They're fully aware of it. The people sending them are fully aware of it. There is, of course, and you can understand why, some kind of speculative, well, when you get back here, we'll talk about it more. But, they realize that the truth is probably it's going to be a trade of lives. Theirs for his, as far as Heydrich goes. And, so incredibly brave characters. As you said, Jesse, by the time they actually touch down in the Czech Republic, they're supposed to be dropped over near Pilsen. They end up 70 miles off course. The British SOE pilot who drops them, and a very experienced pilot by the name of Ron Hockey, a flight lieutenant Ron Hockey, he basically drops in heavy fog, heavy snow, and thinks he's overflying Pilsen. Actually, what he's overflying is the heart of Prague itself, and he drops him only 12 miles from Prague. So the shock these guys get when they hit the ground, their original plan is not to insert directly into Prague because it's quite hot. There are German countermeasures in place. Actually, the flight is picked up and reported in a Gestapo report that particular flight, which dropped the 6 agents on that day, is noted. We know that a single aircraft dropped parachutists on this date, and we're expecting people to insert into the city. As a result of that, these guys pretty much go straight through Prague when they first arrive, another 60 miles over to Pilsen, and then they use that as their cover to make their way into the city several weeks later. So, it's an extremely interesting period.
So you've got the right sort of people, they've got the right sort of training. As you just explained, getting them into the country turns out to be a bit more difficult than expected. So they hit the ground, they need to make their way to where they need to be. And normally, of course, these things do not happen within a vacuum. You already talked a bit about Germans and their countermeasures, and we can talk about this also in a bit more detail later on. But of course, we also have the Czech network there, so the resistance network. So how they're trying to link up with them, and how is this organized at that particular time?
Well, it's pretty ad hoc, to be honest. There's one kind of central character who is his name is he's known as Uncle Heysky. His name is Jan Zelenska Heysky, actually. And he's effectively the linchpin of what we know of the fairly ad hoc Czech resistance, which is centered around Prague. And he's contacted a number of friendly families in the area, a lot of which, by the way, have sons very much like Gabčík and Kubiš, who've left the country and now have a spare room because their son, for example, is a fighter pilot in a Czech squadron in the RAF. That's exactly the case with one of the families. They give up their bedroom because their son's in Britain fighting. So you get a group of friendly families around this Uncle Heysky, who himself is closely intertwined with the Czech Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, who are really leading the way in at least passive resistance against the German oppressors at this point. And Gabčík and Kubiš have been told, right, you need to make at least one central connection, and then we'll filter you into a resistance network, which is effectively a series of, if you like, 1941-42 style Airbnbs. They're going to be rotated around the city along with a group of other agents. So rather than this single rotation, you can imagine, of two agents, what you actually have is 5 or 6 different circles moving at the same time, each with rotating agents, each with their own task, crossing paths every now and then at someone's house. You'll sit down at dinner and there'll be another 2 agents there who've got a completely different job. So the guys do get to meet each other, but nobody's ever truly informed about what the other agent groups are doing. So you get a very active period. The Germans, by the way, we should add to this, are well aware that there is a risk against Heydrich's life. It's been reported in various intelligence documents, particularly putting this idea together of a single lone aircraft being seen dropping agents somewhere over Prague. And, the head of the Gestapo in that area, a man by the name of, this is why I'm going to butcher the language that you two speak fluently. I think it's Karl von Treuenfeld, who is, again, quintessential looking Gestapo chief in Prague, is well aware that Heydrich may well be at risk. In fact, speaks to Heydrich about it and says, we think, you're top of the list of potential assassination targets here. And for whatever reason, Heydrich does not heed the advice. But, that's a little further down the line just yet.
So we've got these guys now on the ground. Heydrich is being warned. Something is probably coming his way. And yes, as you just explained, Dan, he basically just doesn't seem to care an awful lot. He just keeps on normal jogging. He's still out and about. He likes to be seen as the ruler of that particular part of the world. He is also personally very brave. So again, when you rewind a little bit and look at what he'd done before he goes to Bohemia, Moravia. So, for example, he's a fighter pilot on the Eastern Front. He gets shot down. All sorts of stories that play a role there as well. And I think probably, guesswork here a little bit, probably the Czechs are kind of playing with it, are banking on this a little bit as well. So maybe it might be easier to target him than someone else who's got a bigger bodyguard or who might be better protected or might be more cautious. And as you say, Heydrich had been warned through the system. Hitler had warned him before. Himmler had warned him before. You are too audacious. That's not a good thing. We need you for the future of the German Reich. And of course, you can count on this. You can factor this in when you come up with a plan. And of course, what is the plan now? So you need to find a spot where you can actually really attack him, the ambush side. So how do you choose this, and which side is actually chosen?
Well, that's exactly the question that Kubiš and Gabčík have to answer. And they basically, once they're established in Prague, they start spending every waking hour following Heydrich, examining his route, examining his home, everything that he does, trying to find a chink in his armor. And actually, it's not that easy to do. So, of course, they're looking for some way to assassinate him. They're also looking, if they can, and understandably, some way to survive the experience themselves, which adds a different layer of complexity. And there are a couple of major considerations they make. We should add that, by the way, Heydrich, just at the start of April 1942, has picked up a new property, effectively. His wife's come over, his wife and family are now living with him, and he's moved to a little village called Panensky Brezhany, about 15 miles north of Prague, and he's in a villa that's been taken off a rich Jewish family that have been unceremoniously, as you can imagine, kicked out for the purpose. So his home is now outside of the city, but his main office is actually in what we today would call Prague Castle. This is where his kind of seat of power is. So originally what happens is the agents make their way up to the village where his villa is and think, okay, well, can we get into the back garden and snipe at him? Can we find a way to kill him at home? Very heavily protected. There are SS guards around, there are patrol dogs, it's pretty well sewn up. So that's really a no-go. As is his office. It's right in the heart of Prague, very difficult to get to, very strong military presence there. They really think the opportunities there are quite limited. He does make, though, regular journeys back to Berlin. He quite often does this by his own dedicated train. And this is seen as an opportunity as well. So there's talk and even exploration, including a dry run, of trying to derail his train, see if they can take the whole train off the tracks and kill him that way. There'd actually been a failed derailing a few weeks earlier, I think in occupied France, and the results had been quite widely publicized. Nobody was killed, few people got knocks and bruises, but actually it's quite difficult to kill people by derailing a train. So the other option they look at is getting hold of a boy's anti-tank rifle and sniping him through his train window as his train slows down past a particular siding on the outskirts of Prague. Now, this is pretty quickly written off as well. And what it leaves is this one glaring opportunity, and it's the route that he takes on a daily basis directly from his home in Penensky Brezhany to his office at Prague Castle. 15-mile road route, which, by the way, he does take with an escort vehicle. Normally, he has an escort vehicle. He has his driver, Johannes Klein, alongside him. But he's a bit of a speed freak, is Heydrich. It's the reason why he likes fighter planes. It's the reason why he likes daring stuff. He also likes his Mercedes 320 Tourer, which is a Ferrari or Bugatti Veyron of the day. And he regularly outstrips his escort vehicle, and he doesn't really give a damn about it. He's got a big straight road running directly for the first 10 miles of his journey into Prague. And stories of the day say he regularly gets his driver. He sits up front with his driver, tells him to put his foot down, and they time each other and see how quick they can get along that road. Look, the guy's not going to get a speeding ticket, is he? So they give him, and the story goes that he's doing 100+ miles an hour, which in 1942 in a vehicle, that's extremely quick. And he leaves his I'd imagine, incredibly frustrated escort vehicle behind, who say, "Oh, he's done it again. What's the point in doing this?" But of course, that turns out to be a risk. And more specifically, as he gets into the suburbs of Prague, doing 100 miles an hour, there's not a hell of a lot you can do to knock him out. There is some discussion about stringing a wire across the road and trying to decapitate him. He's got a convertible vehicle. That's ruled out. But there's one particular point that Kubiš and Gabčík find, which is a very sharp, like a U-turn into Prague in the northern suburbs. And no matter what kind of character you are, you have to go slow around that corner. He's basically got to stop slow to a crawl. And in that moment, in that point, in that particular location, it's decided that's where that chink in the armor lays.
I mean, if I remember correctly, doesn't the wonders of public transportation also play a role in this plan? Because there are tram tracks. If listeners and viewers, any of you have had the opportunity to visit Prague, one of the things that is a kind of hallmark of the city, of course, is, as some other cities in Europe, trams going along pretty slowly on tracks, crossing intersections. And this is also going to be something that forces him to slow down in the city. I just thought it was interesting that you have this contrast between, fast car, still having to stop for trams, and that plays a role somehow in this plan. Another element that I thought was interesting, and you mentioned some of the ideas about, how do we do this kinetically? How do we inflict the damage on someone's body that we want to inflict? Boy's anti-tank rifle sounds like an interesting plan, but I guess that didn't work out. So what do they end up trying to do? What is the plan to have a kinetic impact, which is a sort of a fancy way of saying how are they actually going to kill him, right, at this street corner? I think part of it involves a modified, special, one-of-a-kind weapon.
It does indeed, yeah, exactly right. So once the location is chosen effectively, the primary means of killing him is actually just to shoot him many, many times as he turns around a corner in a car. That's the chosen thing, is to hose him with Sten rounds as he makes his way around the corner, kill him outright. But there is a backup, and that's going to be a modified British hand-thrown anti-tank grenade, a Type 73 anti-tank grenade, which is going to blow the guy up. So we've got effectively two main considerations from this point of view. I should mention here that when we're talking Heydrich, the things that are known prior to the attack, it's very likely he's going to be taking the same route that he always does. Doesn't vary his route at all. Terrible idea, as he learns. Only him and a driver. He sits in the front of the car. It's a big touring car with a really posh kind of leather rear part. He never sits there. He always sits in the front alongside the driver. It's Czech. We're in the Czech Republic. Ironically, the Germans have instituted, since they've taken over the country, having to drive on the right-hand side of the road. Before that, you didn't have to. Having to drive on the right-hand side of the road is really important because it means that the guys on the inside of the turn can get to within literally an arm's reach of Heydrich. So that's why the Sten is originally gone for. And when we also need to remember, when these guys drop into the Czech Republic, they drop in with a small arsenal with them. So they each carry what's known as a hammerless Colt pistol, 1903 little 7.65 millimeter pocket pistol. Gabčík and Kubiš both have one of those. Gabčík also has a Sten, which is in an attaché case, specially modified attaché case, only with two rounds, 2 magazines. For those that don't know the Sten, it's quite distinctive, cheaply made, stamped metal, horrible thing with the magazine sticking out horizontally sideways. Terribly prone to malfunction, which is exactly what's going to happen actually in this very incident. But each of those men are also carrying with them this modified SOE-made, effectively anti-tank grenade, which can be thrown with a contact fuse on it. So it's not a timed fuse. Literally, it's an impact fuse, blow up, and that could be used to target the car as well. So this is the consideration. What's really, really fascinating about this character, and those of us, those people that are listening to us right now that have maybe come directly from the YouTube video that we've done fairly recently on this, you can get into a level of detail with this operation that I think is almost unsurpassed in terms of absolute finite detail. And the big reason behind that is that the Gestapo descend on the area immediately after the assassination attempt, and they interview everybody. They take photographs of everything. They mark down to the precise inch where each shell case is found and where certain part of the car is found and where the Sten gun is, where the bicycles are. So we have a literal, absolutely detailed scientific map with a complete walkthrough and probably 100, what's referred to at the time, ironically, as crime scene photos taken by the Gestapo detailing every single inch of this street corner. So we can be absolutely precise about the layout, what's going to happen, what the plan is, and how exactly it happens.
All right, so I think we've now fully set the stage for what's going to happen for this infamous assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. But I also think it's a good opportunity for us to wrap up today's episode and talk about the assassination and then all the aftermath in the next episode. So I want to thank you, Dan, for coming and joining us today. And I guess in advance for joining us in the next episode. I also want to remind all of you listeners and viewers out there that if you like this episode, if you thought it was interesting and you like what we do generally on the podcast, of course, you can become a supporter and we'd be happy to have you as one. You can do that by going to bothsidesofthewire.com. There you can also get access to some exclusive content that's not on any of the podcast platforms that you're listening or watching right now. That place is called The War Room. You can even get a free trial if you use the code word Deep Dark Woods. So, thanks for listening and watching, and we will see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. So, I want to thank you, Dan, for coming and joining us today. I want to let all you visitors? Who's a visitor? Are we a museum? Jesus Christ.
There we are. Boom.
Glad it's not only us that do them, yeah.
Yeah.